I'll just share the...
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 1 hour session today, which will be recorded and made available on the SIRS website, along with all the previous sessions for you to engage with. Please feel free to use the chat throughout the session for reflective comments, questions, and points to share. So these sessions are a safe place for us to discuss any research, perspectives and ideas that we might use to provoke change or create new ideas or strategies within our own context or for our own purposes. So welcome everybody from across time zones to the Childhood and Society SIG, where today the difficult dialogue strands explores struggles, resilience and making changes, an in-depth analysis of the experiences of 2 UK nursery school head teachers from minoritised communities. So to introduce our research team and speakers, we have Magdalena Dolinsky is a research assistant here at Middlesex University and early years initial teacher trainer, supervisor and tutor at the Institute for Education and the University College London. Magdalena's research interests include multilingualism and culturally relevant leadership in the early years sector. The second of the team is Selina Pinto, who is a seminar leader here at Middlesex University. Her research interests include race within education, social justice, equality and diversity in the early years sector. And we have Dr. Mona Sark, who is a researcher, author and influencer in early childhood here at Middlesex University as well. So it's an in-house show today. Mona's the PI, and her research explores early years policy and practice, particularly in relation to leadership and development across the sector. So over to you.
Okay, as you've already introduced, I will jump into the background and current data context. Well, just wanted to provide you with a bit of context on the early years workforce related issues and rationale for our research. So the Department of Education do not collect any detailed statistics on ethnicity and early years workforce. And across the sector, about 82% of early years workforce identify as white British, while 69% of children accessing funded early years provision are racialized as white. And the Department of Education annual survey concludes that the early years workforce is in line with ethnicity across the UK population. Therefore, it's not an issue, but there is global recognition for that urgent need for more research to consider ethnic, cultural and linguistic diversity in the early years workforce. And our study stems from the BERA-funded project, Ethnicity and Early Years Workforce, a census of maintained nursery schools in England. And it examined how staff ethnicity reflects the children served by nursery schools, as well as how staff ethnicity intersects with qualification level and leadership responsibilities. And thinking about those issues and inequalities, what we wanted to find out was what is the diversity relative to children and families served by earlier settings, and what is the intersection of ethnicity and qualification level and leadership responsibilities. So 385 nursery schools across England were invited to participate in the study, and in total 95 maintained nursery schools participated. We gathered 490 individual staff responses, and these are our highlight findings. So the first being ethnicity across the sample, and we found that children served by nursery schools are considerably more diverse than the staff in these settings. The second related to staff ethnicity and qualification level, and we found that staff with higher qualifications, levels 4 to 6 and QTS, are less diverse than those with a level 3 early years qualification. And also staff in senior leadership are less diverse than those in middle management and in teaching roles. And this essentially was an aid for us to explore our understanding of the lived experiences and perspectives of early years leaders. And we wanted to concentrate on the problem of inequalities experienced by early years leaders, understand the barriers to achieving higher qualifications and climbing the leadership ladder, as well as developing a deeper understanding of representation in early years pedagogy and practice and its impact. So building on our understanding of the challenges this research aims to address within the context of early years, our research methodology conforms to the pragmatist paradigm, and that we also wanted to encourage a reflexive approach towards research participation. So the two interviews analysed in this study are part of a sample totaling 14 semi-structured interviews with early years head teachers across England. And the nature of those semi-structured interviews allowed us to retain an extent of control over the questions, which related to the three highlight findings that you see on the slide. However, participants were free to elaborate and reflect upon their lived experiences during the course of the interview. And what followed from those brief discussions were deep reflections and thought processes, providing answers as to how and why ethnic inequalities are deeply embedded within the culture of career progression in the context of early years. So we know that little or no dialogue is taking place when it comes to social justice oriented leadership progression. And we've studied why educators from minoritized communities face far more challenges and barriers into progression to leadership. What we found was that leadership positions are acquired at an older age and when compared to white practitioners' development, and that was also confirmed in other research within the background to literature. There's been reports of difficulties on journey to leaderships, which were disclosed, along with reports of racism, particularly when working in predominantly white settings. The National Association of Schoolmasters Union of Women Teachers conducted a study in 2009 with 556 state school teachers of ethnic minority background, and the research reported discrimination on grounds of participants' ethnic background. And that was the case when attempting to progress through to leadership roles. And then this so in alignment with the principle of counter storytelling from critical race theory, this gravitated our research towards the lived experiences of early years leaders. And we know that the theory exposes the ways in which race and racism plays out in our society and offers a lens through which we can concentrate on power distribution when considering the lived experiences of early years leaders, of leadership in the early years sector, and exposing the deeply embedded racism. The principle of counter storytelling unsettles the narratives of whiteness and is looking for voices to be heard. And as that notion pointed out that racism is ordinary, it encourages color blindness and meritocratic rhetoric as a permanent element of our society's makeup. Therefore, it's crucial to make space and time to tell stories that ought to be told, enabling our participants to communicate those stories to disrupt that relentless continuity of social inequalities. And building on the approach of counter storytelling, the need for counter narratives in the light of disclosed experiences by those from minoritized communities was the intention of giving voice as an act of challenge to the dominant and traditional narratives. It also encourages the investigation of our social realities from different perspectives and therefore offering the potential to give voices to those early years leaders whose experiences may include disadvantage and struggles on their journey to leadership. And therefore, we believe that the critical race theory here offers the acknowledgement of leadership and how it is intertwined with the dynamics of race, gender, and class. And this is what led us to think about and understand intersectional feminism and those emerging identities of leadership, where we place the value of relationships and collaboration, prioritizing the importance of having culturally and linguistically diverse leaders and practitioners. Wanting to expand our understanding of intersectionality as a framework of analysis rooted in critical race theory and demonstrate the multiplicity of identities in the context of our participants' narratives. Intersectional feminism adds multiple layers to those experiences, and the journey for female leaders in early years from minorities communities is one of inherently complex and shifting the nature. Therefore, in the context of our study, we wanted to draw on the work of Chin, who demonstrated that intersectionality of gender and ethnicity contribute to the dynamics affecting leadership, such as stereotypes, social role expectations, power status, and so forth. And emotions play an important role in the creation of relationships between individuals and environment. Affective experiences becoming invested and attached to the relationships of power and therefore becoming more and more complex. And we've also wanted to draw on the work of Tembo, who foregrounds the inability to measure and report the experience encounters of inequality as felt, and how the significance of those power relations generate and form effective encounters manifest in everyday life experiences, as he delves into the effective encounters of ordinary Black life in his qualitative research. And on that note, we would like to present you with our findings, which we have categorized into 3 themes: struggle and effective fallout, resilience amidst turmoil, and commitment to representation.
Okay, so Jenny states, despite being ready to be a head teacher from age 30, I didn't get there until 49. That's 19 years of me knowing that I was more than ready to do this job. I was just a paper exercise, as I was told once again that I was not a good fit. That was 20 years ago, and 19 years later, I was still not a good fit in the same school to be an executive leadership role. There are some areas that are blocked for people of colour. Tamina, I'm struggling as a head teacher here because even my staff are not culturally diverse. My teachers are mostly white and my TAs and workers are all white but one. When I go for head teacher meetings, I'm the only person of colour in the room. It's quite strange and it's quite different for me. And I feel as a head teacher, I'm on my own. There's not that drive and push within this area for us to have representation, and from a leadership perspective as well. I just find it very difficult.
Yeah, so as we can see from those 2 quotes, Jenny and Tamina encountered an effective fallout, including feelings of resentment, anger, discomfort. Both have expressed the experience of constant barriers when attempting to progress in their careers and the lack of opportunities. Jenny explains the hardships experienced when progressing into senior leadership position in line with the research, and the explanation of the length of time for progressing into senior leadership, which for some individuals is 20 years. And for Jenny, it was indeed that time until she proved herself to be worthy and competent of career progression. To add to the challenges progressing into early years leadership, feelings of isolation and loneliness are not uncommon at all. Tamina highlighted how the lack of cultural diversity at all levels in an organization impact on her feelings and experiences as a leader. Without diversity in the organization, she felt that she was having to swim against the tide. She is the force providing the drive and push that she notices as lacking in her area. She also goes on to explain her day-to-day struggles in domains of attending team meetings, being surrounded by culturally homogenous body of staff in the wider community. The experiences that Jenny and Tamina reflect upon highlight a range of feelings and emotions which tend to be short-lived and occur during those complex experiences. Nevertheless, the effect encompasses a stance of the conscious, sometimes unconscious experience of those emotions, which drive Jenny and Tamina to embrace the complex emotions and attune themselves to the effective fallouts which are shaped by their lived experiences.
Jenny, getting a job is just the beginning of the journey. The journey really starts when you're proving what you're doing and it makes people uncomfortable, or when you realize when people want you to fail and you cannot relax. You cannot afford to slip in any way, and if you make a mistake, you must be clear how it happened. Yes, it's like under a microscope. I will double and triple check everything. There's an assumption that Black people are suspicious and fraudulent. It seems natural that people assume that I'm a criminal, and that happens with being a senior leader.
Yes, and Jenny, as well as Tamina, have revealed experiences of systematic racism in the form of unfair additional scrutiny while doing the job, overt and covert racism among staff they were managing, and biased recruitment and selection processes. Jenny refers to navigating the system differently to a Caucasian person when speaking about their perception of practitioners who may be from different ethnic minority community as often stereotyped as incapable, uneducated, and unqualified, while undergoing constant scrutiny and experiencing bias. However, the added scrutiny, that's what keeps Jenny going. And even though Jenny felt confident and effective as a leader, she felt that she had to prove herself and experience greater scrutiny. Not only the journey to leadership for Jenny took 19 years, the constant suspicions and scrutiny of maintaining the position is an encounter on a daily basis. The experience of ongoing surveillance and obstacles faced on the journey to early years headship highlight the tensions in which racism plays out in our society. Equally important is the lack of trust and suspicions manifesting from within the early year settings, as Jenny describes in her encounters of her own staff conducting an anonymous survey, which resulted in her own staff refusing to be led by a Black leader. So these examples of systematic racism are engraved in a culture of some early years settings are conspicuous. And early years leaders very quickly learn how culture and subculture works within their workplace, attempting to navigate the system despite being constantly under surveillance.
Jenny, I've been very specific to get males in our setting, and I have a male Indian teacher. We are all feeding dynamic to our children. We are talking about progressive education, not traditional, as traditional is the root of the issue. Tamina, I understand the need to have those role models of the school. I'm constantly linking and staffing as well. It is just making sure that I have that diversity within my staff. When I interviewed the Asian member of staff, English was her second language. She spoke Punjabi. It wasn't difficult to actually understand what she was saying. Per her accent and her dialect, straight away, two of my governors who are white said no to her. She was the strongest candidate. It is starting at the recruitment process. I put the book, it's called My Hair, and it's about this Black girl that has beads in her hair. I put it out in the reading corner, and this girl came up to me and said, "Miss, I am so happy. I said, why? Why are you happy, sweetheart? She said, because I found a book with a girl that looks just like me.
And as you can see from those quotes, these are very powerful learning experiences and demonstrated by both Jenny and Tamina. And they're both deeply committed to improving cultural diversity and representation for the sake of children and families served by the early years sector. A sense of consciousness of optimizing opportunities to make a difference is a high priority for our participants and other early years leaders in the sector. And the motivations for making changes happen are shaped by self-efficacy and vocalization of dialogues about their agenda, increase in diversity within the settings. Despite the endless efforts enabling cultural diversity to exist within their settings, both Jenny and Tamina express uncertainty about the commitment of those around them, including those more senior colleagues in the local authorities. And this is often reflected in the negativity surrounding minoritized communities, in line with media portrayals and the continued fear of critical race theory having an impact on the dynamics between the early years leaders' morale, pursuing changes to take place, and the external bodies of staff, which may have other priorities on their agenda. What is more, Jenny states that our society fears aspects of critical race theory because it creates discomfort and denial. And while this is the root of the issue that feeds into education on all levels, Tamina also expressed the fact that having role models of the same ethnicity and having that self-confidence and that identity retained is very important. And one of my favorite quotes is that encountering a smile on that child's face, I can just imagine hearing those words. I can just imagine the joy of, for simply the reason of seeing herself in a picture book, and the happiness it brings is a deeply effective fallout. Early years leaders recognize the increase in diversity of children accessing early years within the UK, and the need it creates with the provision. And what this means is, in the context of our research findings, is a manifestation of the complexity of individual identities intersecting with the experiences held by our participants, such as this. It's a quote by Tamina: when you're a person of color, you see things more and you see the need for that representation. You realize the importance of diversity within your staff, more so than I would say by my white counterparts. Moving forward, and one of the challenges that we came across throughout our quantitative and qualitative research was the need for reflexivity in our research, which has been continually deeply emotional. And I'll leave it for Selena to elaborate.
Yeah, so our effective responses to the narratives shared by participants have been shaped by our own individual identities and experiences. We acknowledge that our own individual identities, experiences, and ethnicities have influenced the way we collected and analysed the data. Hearing about leaders' experiences within early years sector have been deeply emotional, having to prove themselves over and over again and subject to prejudice. Embracing the full spectrum of emotions by connecting with each other, offering mutual support and keeping reflective journals, our team reflexivity has been nourished. We've also heard from white British leaders who lack awareness about unconscious bias in the recruitment processes, which work to limit diversity in the workforce. The emotions of participants exploring highly emotive subjects, we had not fully appreciated the levels of vulnerability we were asking from participants. So to summarize, so as interviewers, we really encountered levels of openness and vulnerability. And it kind of shows the importance of head teachers and teachers to reflect on their lived experiences. And from these interviews, it seems that they haven't had this opportunity before. So we can see that it's very, very important for us to do this in the early years sector. And yeah, it was a heartbreaking reality for us as interviewers. And yeah, that's our reflective point.
Yeah, so just final thoughts. Our findings prompt us to explore the complexity of human nature and our diverse experiences and individual narratives, all which have personal and collective meanings. We're not generalizing the experiences of all early years leaders, particularly as we've not studied the private, voluntary, and independent early years sector. And we're aware that the dialogue of counter storytelling and intersectional feminism in relation to the lived experiences of early years leaders may not warrant the dismantle of racism, difficult endeavors, prejudice, and discrimination. This area of research is understudied, and therefore we're offering this as a point of encouragement for scholars to pursue interest in further investigation, as should be, and further theorizing is very much needed in the context of feminist scholarship of ethnically and linguistically diverse early years leaders. And on that note, we would like to conclude and welcome any thoughts, reflections, questions, if you have any. It'll be great to engage in dialogue with all of you.
Okay, thank you so much for such a provocative exploration into what's happening in early years and what's been happening in early years for such a long time. And for somebody who's worked in it for about 33 decades, let's say, that's enough to share. It felt like I was going back in time, going back into practice in the 90s and the noughties as to what I saw and felt happening. And when you were saying it today, it was provoking so much about the institutionalized habitus of how practice unfolds and continues, and that level of consciousness that isn't there. And what made me smile was like, there's so many, when you use the example of the practitioner who waited 19 years, and she knew 19 years ago that she was ready to do that role then. I mean, her resilience, her, so much about her is just amazing. But it's just the level of competence. And I don't mean for these people, I mean for those who are in the system who aren't engaging with their reflective consciousness. I think is really powerfully coming out through here on many levels to what you've been speaking about today. So I know there's going to be lots of questions and discussions opening from our people that are here with us today. So would anybody like to, Lourdes, was your hand up? Would you like to come in?
I was clapping.
Oh, you were clapping.
It was really good. Sorry, I have my camera on, so I look a little bit disheveled today. Well, that was really interesting, Selena and Magdalena, amazing. And I worked in the private sector, but there is an element of systematic racism, and I don't think I've been subject to racism, but I did feel I felt distant sometimes from my white counterparts, and I don't think there was any malice behind it, to be honest with you, but there was an element of, we do have our jokes, our in-jokes, we have our way of doing things. There is a history behind us. We go to the same, we attend the same places, and we have the same culture. And I worked really hard to break that barrier, I have to say. But once I kind of feel like I finally broke through, I felt very included, but there was a barrier nevertheless. I have, yeah. So that was one of my personal experience working 25 years in the early years sector. I did feel a degree of you are different, but as that teacher said, she waited 19 years. I kept waiting, and it was very the satisfaction I felt once I broke it. So I think there is an element of I don't want to demonize the white community either, because that's not. I think there is a shield, but once it's broken, it's actually very easy to be in it. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
No, I mean, I'll just respond to this because as you're talking, it just makes me draw on what Tembo's research is about. It's just that those emotions that compile and form those and it's just that feeling that sometimes you can't explain, but it's there, and it contributes to how you experience certain things in certain situations. That would be my response. I don't know whether Mona or Selena would like to contribute.
Well, I've worked in early years for over 6 years, and I've worked in numerous early year settings as well, private and a maintained nursery school as well. And all of my management was white. And that's just an example. And there wasn't much diversity, I would say, which you can see it does impact on the children. They want to see books and diversity within the setting, which I always implemented. However, I just always felt that there was a lack of diversity within the settings, within the representation. I just wanted to add that on.
Thank you. Mona, did you want to come in there? And then I think Lee had his hand up, and then Jane, so we'll go in that order.
Sure. I mean, I think, yeah, it's so fascinating, Lourdes, because I don't think we wanted to demonize anybody either. But it's interesting because with the 14 interviews, so we focused on the 2 interviews today, but the other 12 then are from white nursery school head teachers. And I think it's interesting, like, what a wide spectrum of views are held by those nursery school head teachers, all the way from a kind of real desperation. I'm trying to make my workforce more culturally and linguistically diverse. I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. I'm really good at it. It's succeeding, or it's not working as much as I want. But all the way to, and Selena touched on it, some really quite overt statements of bias in the recruitment process, in kind of branding particular groups and stereotyping particular groups as they won't be able to do this for me, they won't be good at doing this with the children, and so it's a really kind of wide spectrum. So yeah, we don't want to kind of set up a dichotomy, a polarity between white nursery school head teachers and minoritized nursery school head teachers. But I think it is really interesting to engage with kind of how those barriers manifest differently.
Thank you. Lee, thank you, Mona. This is really getting juicy now, because I've got some questions, but I'll wait my turn.
Thanks all. Really, really interesting and thought-provoking. I've got 2 questions, but given what Mona said, that you only had 2 interviews from minority ethnic backgrounds, the first one might not really apply, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. And it's really whether, having finally broken through, whether you got a sense, or whether people talked about in the interviews about whether they felt like they could be themselves in those roles and bring anything distinctive to those roles, or do they feel that there's just an whether it's so rare to become a Black female leader that you have to deny aspects of your identity and conform to the white governor's expectations who appointed you. So I'm just wondering whether there was a sense in your data that people felt there were tensions about who they could be and how they could inhabit those roles, or whether they were having to deny aspects of their identity or their gut feelings about what they did in practice to conform. But then also, you said that you were situating this in a kind of pragmatist paradigm. So being pragmatic, you've listened to these people, you've heard some good and terrible things by the sounds of it. What would you take from this as people working in the sector? Obviously, you don't have the definitive answer, but what, if anything, would you take away and recommend as changed practice or better practice that might move us on in some practical shape or form?
So referring to your second question, we have, so Mona looked at retention training and within the early years sector, and she looked at the recruitment process in more detail. So there's definitely, I mean, just to give you an example of what I'm thinking, is one of the methods that a nursery school took into an approach that they took in terms of recruiting is, was it unconscious? No. Mona, can you jump in, because I've got it. Unconscious.
Yeah. Are we talking about the setting where they had a kind of do they fit in process? Yeah, so it's quite, is that the one?
So that was one, and in comparison to the other, when they've had the psychological testing.
Yes. So on a very kind of basic, practical, concrete level, we talked to nursery school head teachers about their recruitment processes, and there's huge diversity there. There are no kind of guidelines that everybody follows, and so we had all the way from kind of, they come in for a day, we see whether they fit in with the team. It's completely fair to see whether they fit in. Turns out we don't have anybody that's not white, but you know, that's not our fault, they didn't fit in. All the way to very rigorous levels of anonymizing the recruitment process, anonymizing the CVs, doing psychometric assessments on the basis that those would be fairer than interviews if they were to feed in. So yeah, huge kind of changes there, or diversity there in terms of recruitment procedures. So yeah, on a very practical level, we've been able to kind of showcase, here are different ways that people are recruiting their staff, see what you think about them. And I think the ultimate thing has been it's difficult dialogues, which is why we're happy to present here, has actually not been to say to the sector, you should do this, some people are doing this and this is best practice, but instead be able to open up a discussion around, here is what different people are doing, what do you think, you know, and just trying to kind of open up some possibilities and then have some conversations around that, because it does feel still like a very kind of taboo area of discussion, I think, for the sector. So even just opening up the discussion feels like a contribution of a modest contribution.
Thank you. Thanks, Mona. Okay, I think we'll move on to Jane. Again, very provocative though to not go into that in more depth, but Jane's had her hands up, so we'll go to Jane next. And if anybody else is there wants to ask, please let me know.
Yeah, just thank you to you all. I mean, that's a really troubling set of findings, and I think that's the thing that I'm taking away from it, is how little has changed. And I know that Angela had said that in her immediate response, but you know, thinking back to my own PhD research in the early 2000s and looking at narratives of those in nurseries, but I was looking, there was a maintained nursery, a private sector nursery, and a voluntary sector nursery. And I certainly saw more diversity in the private sector and the voluntary than in the maintained sector. And I know you'd mentioned on one of your slides that the focus of this is very much on maintained nurseries, but I would be really interested to kind of stretch it out and think about those other spaces, because and I suspect there's probably still issues of racism and so on, but I do get the sense that there is more diversity in those spaces. But of course, the maintained sector is kind of elite, in the sense that there are better terms and conditions, there are better career structures, there are better. It's, you know, it's a kind of, it's the place that people want to work because it's seen as. So I suppose that's one of the thoughts that I had, and the other was around how easily racism can be reduced to the individual or individual behaviour, and actually it's systemic and it's institutional and it's cultural. And so I was just wondering what you were doing with critical race theory in terms of analysing your data, because you've got these really powerful narratives from individuals, and then you've got this big sample of nursery schools. So I'm just interested to know how you're going to mobilise critical race theory to interrogate how racism actually plays out, and what can be done on that kind of systemic, institutional, cultural level. Of course, it's individual behaviour, but it's more than that, isn't it? And you're kind of you're making the connections to affect and the feltness of racism, and I think that's really important. And so I'm just wondering how all these different kind of modes of analysing and making sense of this, you know, how their explanatory potential, I suppose, and how that gives us some kind of insight as to why this just goes on, you know, decade after decade, and in different contexts. In, you know, you look to the US and Europe, and, you know, it's not specific to the UK either. So I'm just interested to know what you're going to do with these theories to be able to provide explanations and recommendations, I guess, is the short question, rather than, yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's really useful to hear your thoughts and reflections on it. In this study, what we're thinking is, in terms of the critical race theory, we wanted to kind of go in with the principle of counter storytelling to essentially, in, you know, very simple terms, bring the stories to life, give voices to our participants, and kind of go along with what we hear from them. In terms, like Mona mentioned, in terms of implications and further recommendations, I think we're very much crawling, and I think it is because the quantitative study was the first study into ethnicity and early years workforce. What followed on from that was just further elaboration on those findings in the study that we've conducted. So I think there's a lot more scope for further explore. So I don't have a definite answer in terms of what we'd recommend, because it's like it is very taboo, and sometimes it's difficult to get people engaged in dialogue for many different reasons. So I would probably conclude this as purely a starting point to engage in conversations, and just let those stories kind of be heard, be voiced.
Yeah, just adding on to that, I think if we don't discuss it, nothing's going to change, and it's going to be the same thing again in another 20 years. So I think the main thing is, even when we have these training sessions in early years, maybe we can have like a reflective point just to reflect on our experience, just as an example. Because again, if we just have these traditional training and, you know, maybe just educare training for early years staff, it's not really going to push what we want to talk about. And I think that, you know, is reflected or emphasized in critical race theory with the counter storytelling. I just wanted to add that point on as well.
Yeah, and if I may, I'm not sure whether you wanted to say something, Angela.
No, I'm here just to jump in if I need to. I'd rather not. You guys carry on.
No, yeah, and just referring to that as well, I mean, we as much as it was very emotional throughout for all participants, you know, it was, as for us, it was very, very emotional for us because, you know, we've, like Selena mentioned earlier, you know, we've encountered, you know, surprising levels of honesty, openness, and vulnerability. We've also found ourselves dealing with a lot of defensiveness we had not anticipated. And, you know, it was also, we also aware of the fact that, you know, we're all white as a research, but we appear as white, but we're not white British. And I think that also probably had an impact on the way that our participants approached the interviews. We can't say it hadn't, because it definitely had an impact. But yeah, just wanted to add that to the aspect of study.
Thank you. I mean, really powerful. And again, the point that yourself and Selena are making is that the more time you have to talk, to dialogue, the more you're going to be able to extract ideas. Someone I've spent 8 years on dialogue and using facilitation to open up spaces. And I'm wondering, how did you in your research begin to open up those spaces for these narratives to be shared? Because you've spoken about trust and, you know, people speaking out when it's not been the norm, and that takes so much preparation, it takes so much emotional labor. So I'm wondering how you know, went about that, because that's a process on its own that I'm guessing you haven't even touched upon today. But I know from trying to open up dialogues, particularly with children, that can be so complex. So I'm just wondering what that was like for you in project.
Yeah, I mean, so also in total, we've tried to reach all maintained nursery schools in England, which was more approximately about 400, and only 95 actually responded, and we were able to gather that data. But out of the 95 schools that we've actually managed to collect individual responses from, only 14 responded and wanted to be interviewed for that qualitative part. So that in itself shows a lot of resistance and reluctance. And I think, yeah, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy, but from the people that we have heard, that there was a lot of enthusiasm and there was a lot of passion in mapping that understanding of a culturally diverse earlier settings and what they would like it to be and what they would like it to see. I think some participants were seeking out to be heard. I think it was very important for them to be heard and to voice their stories. Whereas, like I've mentioned earlier, with some participants, I think there was a lot of defensiveness, and there was a lot of unconscious bias that was coming out. So it was a tricky journey, still is. But the more we engage with the transcript of interviews, I mean, even earlier today, as we're going through the slides, I was literally just saying, you know, how is that possible? We literally had goosebumps as we were reading back the quotes, because they're very, very, they're very, very emotional.
And I wanted to add as well, when we were interviewing these participants, it was very varied, the responses. Some questions, other people are very open to discuss and, you know, will really show their lived experience, really wants to, you know, show their passion. And then others will really just give one sentence answers. So it was a really, for me personally, it was a very varied responses in relation to one question. So again, just adding on the point is that it's so important that we have these discussions so people don't feel like they can't discuss further. Of course they can discuss further. So we were probing and encouraging this. But yeah, some weren't as open as others. So yeah, just wanted to add on that.
Okay, just wondered if, thank you so much. Anybody else from our participants have a question that you would like to ask? I do have more, so I'll step in, but I don't want to. Anybody coming up?
I think Claire just mentioned in the chat, it's just shocking that so few maintain nursery even volunteered to participate. And yes, yeah, absolutely right. We're hoping to get more nurseries on board, but it was even quite difficult to get those 95 on board. Kind of constantly nudging.
Were any of those schools and nurseries linked to schools, or were they settings on their own right?
Somewhere, yeah.
No, I was wondering if there's any variation in results between a nursery in a maintained school or a nursery that's its own kind of silo. And I wondered if there was any difference coming out through there. Would there be inherited norms because of the school influence, or would it be, you know, different in a nursery school where they had their own kind of culture evolving? I just wondered if anything like that came out.
Not as much as the geographical location did, but because they're anonymized, the results were pure on the responses. But yeah, I think the geographical demographics was more of a matter.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Claire, again, you've got a couple of points in there. Claire was also, I missed a point earlier from Claire who talked about the resources and the books and the need for representation. So Claire, did you want to come in on that, or did you have another point?
Sorry, I had another point, but yeah, it's just I mean, the publishing world is kind of aware of this to some extent, but there is I think it was 2018 the Clippy report said, you know, an ethnic minority child would be more likely to ask to identify with a toy or an animal as a main character than a child who looked like themselves. At that point, I think it was about 3% were BAME characters. So it was like 52% of characters were human and 48% of characters were toys or animals. But of that 52, but of the total, only 3% were BAME characters, you know, so it was very, very unlikely for an ethnic minority child to see themselves represented in a picture book. And there is an attempt to make things more diverse, but it's very slow progress, and the publishing world is, you know, very white, very upper middle class. They've now got pathways to try and encourage what you could consider non-traditional authors, i.e. authors who are ethnic minority, LGBTQ, working class, you know, to write books for all age groups, including adults. But it's a very white, heteronormative, upper middle class industry. The point I wanted to make was David Olusoga, the British Nigerian historian, sort of talked about how in a few years, you know, 30% of children in schools will not be white British. They will be of some other kind of ethnic background. And I'm just thinking, as those people come through the education sector, presumably they will then seek to join the education sector as professional educators in some form or other as well. So that might help the diversity issues. And also I'm making comparisons here with things from comparative education. So for example, you know, we think of the Nordic countries as being very egalitarian, but they have very little ethnic representation in their educational workforce. And that's often because of a sort of native speaker criterion for entry. So, you know, if the immediate sort of the first hurdle is you have to be a native speaker of the language, that immediately sort of disadvantages anyone who came to the country as a child. I mean, it raises other issues with people of a migrant background who were born and brought up in the country. I remember at one conference meeting an early years practitioner who was of Arab origin from one of the Nordic countries. She wasn't, I think it might have been Norway, I can't remember now. And I didn't realize at the time how unusual she was. She was kind of saying how unusual she was, and she would go to these to conferences and meetings in her home country, and people would kind of do a double take because they basically weren't used to seeing an Arab woman in the meeting there. But you know, she was a native speaker because she'd been born and brought up in that country and done well academically and had gone into the education sector. But she said, you know, she confounded people's expectations. I mean, you know, I don't want to be an apologist for things, but at least in the UK, we aren't putting those sorts of ridiculous hurdles in front of people. At least we recognise people can be multilingual.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Magda or Selina want to respond before we conclude?
Yeah, I mean, it's just regarding, as you were speaking, Clara, I thought about one of the responses one of the quotes that were on the slides actually about a candidate who had English as a second language, and that was an issue. But also recently I've been at a meeting where they were discussing teacher standards and what a postgraduate student needs to do and acquire. Obviously, there's a long list of requirements, and on one of those requirements, there is a good standard of standard of English, and that was very ambiguous because what is that? Does that mean that a teacher can communicate clearly, or there was quite a lot of discussion around it. And then also there was a lot of emphasis put on students whose English is their second language. So I think it's debatable in terms of.
I think, can I just come in, because obviously I've got a linguistic background. I mean the sort of international, if you look at something like the European Union standards and things like that, it talks about international intelligibility, so that functional proficiency is defined not as whether you could pass as a spy in that country and people not realize you spoke another language as well, or you were born somewhere else, but that you were functional in terms of international intelligibility, and that anyone who spoke, if we take English as an example, that spoke English as a language would understand what you were saying in English. Or say, for example, if you were talking about Spanish intelligibility, anyone who spoke Spanish, whether they were a native speaker or non-native speaker, could understand what that person was saying in Spanish. And that does mean a certain level of I suppose what we could call grammatical standard. And then you sort of get into the debates about what grammatical standards are acceptable and not acceptable. But then if you're getting into grammatical standards, what is often seen as a working class vernacular, whatever colour somebody's skin, would be seen as not acceptable. So if people are kind of saying we was instead of we were, and those sorts of things, that would be seen as non-standard, non-acceptable.
Okay, I'm going to just hand over to Magdala and Selina, just keeping our 1 hour lunch break. So if you'd have to final conclusion.
But it's a very contested area, and it is an area where there's an awful lot of debate.
Yeah, Magdala, Selina.
I'd just like to thank you all so much for joining us, and the fact that we're able to engage in dialogue and a lot of different perspectives and reflections, really. So thank you so much, and we hope to be able to discuss further in the future.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you for joining us. I really enjoyed today, and I hope that we did leave something with you and something that you can take on board. And yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time, your expertise, your research in the field, and for joining us, and really magnificent, provocative points that we would love to welcome back in the future. And just for the rest of us, I know you're thanking everybody too. Our next Childhood and Society SIG will be next Monday, the 3rd of April, with Christina Deju, Samoranda Sabina Moldovan, and Bogdan Mateo from West University Timisoara, and they will be discussing their interests and research in online, offline space. So we look forward to seeing you all then, and thank you very much. Just 1 minute over, so thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.